So let's talk about storing deer hides for the long term, because often when hides come in, you're not going to have time to get to scraping all of your hides before they would rot on you naturally. So there are a bunch of different options when it comes to storage of hides. One option, of course, is you could scrape all of the hides as they come in and then either tan them then or dry them to tan later, which is one way that I particularly like because it means you don't need to use freezers, you don't have to salt the hides. However, that means you have to have enough time to scrape all of your hides as they're coming in, which is often not the case. So then you're looking at some kind of method to store them so you can scrape them later. That looks like either drying the hides, in which case you want to flush them well, freezing the hides, in which case you're going to need a good-sized freezer, like a chest freezer, and the power to run that freezer, or wet salting. So drying hides is a good option if you don't have available to you the other methods, but it makes the hides harder to scrape because the glues that are in the hides are going to glue the grain layer down to the dermis layer, and then it's always going to be harder to scrape later, even when you have it fully re-soaked. Freezer is great, but I don't usually have room in a freezer, and I often have lived off-grid where I don't have any refrigeration at all. So that isn't an option. So the next best option is salting your hides. And what I recommend is a process called wet salting, where you're salting the hide so that it can stay in a moist condition, as opposed to drying and salting, which you'll read about sometimes in old scout craft books or leather tanning manuals. But the whole idea of salting the hides is so they don't have to dry out, so that you don't ever get to that really glued on grain layer, which is going to make them harder to scrape eventually. Let's talk about what to look for and how to salt your hides. So you can salt a hide that hasn't been fleshed. If you're skinning really well, then you might not even need to do very much fleshing, but usually you're going to end up having hides that have a little bit of flesh on them, even if it's just what's called the fell muscle, the twitch muscle. It makes the skin twitch when flies and such land on it, so that is a thin layer of muscle. So these hides are all fleshed, because I really prefer storing hides nice and clean without meat and gunk on them. It takes a lot less salt, they're a lot cleaner and easier to deal with, they're lighter weight, and they don't get nearly as funky. So generally speaking, anywhere from 1 to 2 quarts for a medium-sized deer hide, of course a little bit more for big hides and a little bit less for smaller hides. Sure, I get plenty of salt into those edges. Hides. And a good kind of salt to use is salt from a feed store. Some people recommend salt for roads, but you never know what kind of other additives have been in salt like that. So this just salt that you can buy in a 50-pound sack from a feed store is a great way to go. Quite inexpensive and will last you a while. And then I'm going to be working the salt in, and I want to pay special attention to the edges to make sure that there aren't any rolled over bits at the edges of the hide that become little pockets that didn't get salted, because that is going to be a place where that hide can rot. So I just kind of pour out a generous quantity of salt onto the hide, and then I work it in all over the hide, getting a nice even layer, maybe 1/8 to 1/4 inch thick. Okay, so that's pretty well salted. So I'm going to fold it in half and then roll it up. And now, because there's an edge exposed on all sides, that's going to be able to drain. And then I'm going to put it in a Tupperware, like a large tote, up on some concrete blocks so that it can drain and not be sitting in its own funk. And then after about 24 to 48 hours, when it still feels nice and pliable, but it's gotten a good bit of the moisture out, it should feel nice and lightweight, and it won't have any visible salt crystals probably at that point. Then I'll take it out, I'll put another thin layer of salt on it, and then I'm going to package it into bags so that it's actually going to be really protected from drying out further. I don't want it sitting in its own funky juices, but I want it to stay moist and not dry out over time. Now I am placing each of these up at an angle so that the cut side is towards the bottom, and angled so that the side of the hide is angled down so that it's easy for those hide juices to drain on out. Alright, so now these hides have been salted and rested up so that they can drain for about 24 hours, and they're definitely changed in texture. I'm not sure how easy it is to see, but they're a good deal stiffer and less pliable than they were, so that's because of how much moisture has drained out of them. So you can see how much moisture has drained out from this container of 4 hides in the last 24 hours, so that's great. This is all moisture that we want out of there so the hides aren't sitting in their own funk. Okay, let's get these wrapped up for realsy. Lay it out and just kind of look over it and make sure I didn't miss. Oh, see, there's a spot that got kind of missed. It was rolled up on itself. So make sure all of my edges look good. And you can see it's got some kind of more pockets here and there. Again, that's from it kind of changing shape due to losing moisture, and more in some places than others. So once I'm satisfied that it looks good, it's got enough salt, now I'm going to roll the edges in like that. And I try to do it so it's about in thirds or quarters. And then I'm going to roll the neck and the rump in towards each other. So now I don't have any exposed edges. The whole hide is a nice little compact bundle. Okay, so I'm ready to label these 2 bags black-tailed does. I've got 4 really nice small black-tailed doe hides. So those will be great, and then I'll have those labeled alongside my bigger black-tailed bucks, which are going to be significantly larger, thicker, and stronger hides, each with its own particular purpose.